So I've shot 3 different feature films on 3 different cameras. One on the Arri Alexa Mini, one on the Ursa Mini Pro 12K, and one on the Panasonic Lumix S5, which are all very different priced, where the Arri Alexa Mini is $30,000, the Ursa Mini Pro 12K is around $7,000, and you can now get the Lumix S5 for around $800 used. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about my experience using those cameras, what type of camera I would use again, and just compare them and how they might be similar and how they differ. First off, I'll start with the Arri Alexa Mini, which is a high-end cinema camera. It costs around $30,000. And we used this on a project called Good Boy, which I was the director, screenwriter, and director of photography on. It's about a guy who constantly acts and dresses up as a dog. It's a psychological thriller, which has been out for a couple of years now. This was a very low-budget production. We were only around 4 people behind camera, and then around 2 to 3 people in front of the camera most of the time. And we had very few locations. We only shot with natural and practical lights. So it was very important that we had a lot of dynamic range, which is where the Arri Alexa Mini really excels. The reason why we got to use this camera is because the production was part of our master studies. So we got to borrow the camera from the school I was studying at. I mean, the image quality is kinda unbeatable. It just looks amazing. I was quite new when we shot this film. This was around 4 years ago. So I wasn't as experienced as I am now. So I didn't really know what I was doing. And the great thing about using the Arri Alexa Mini in that case is that it's very forgiving. At no point did I clip the highlights or crush the shadows or anything like that. I was always able to retain the quality. Everything was shot handheld. I used the easy rig, and I think one of the problems with the camera is that it's very heavy. I was the DOP, but I was also the camera operator. So when you're shooting days on end, it can become quite tiring shooting with that big of a camera. And also another problem, shooting with that big of a camera. It was a very low budget production. We didn't really actually have the money to use that type of camera. We got it through the film school we were studying at. We were really scared, using the camera. Scared of ruining it, scared of destroying it. Which is obviously, when you're borrowing a camera, that should always be the case. But that was especially the case with the Arri Alexa Mini. We were students. It was the price of a car. Not even a cheap car. It's the price of a normal car. So I think that was the main issue of using the camera, is that it's quite expensive. I guess in some ways it was even holding me back a little bit because I was so scared while using it. I was also becoming tired quite easily. And we shot this in ProRes 4444 in 3.2K, not even in 4K. The Arri Alexa Mini shoots in 3.2K. The image that you're getting just looks amazing. Not only does it have amazing dynamic range, the colors looks amazing, and actually I edited the whole film on my laptop, which is at this point around 10 years old. I edited it in DaVinci Resolve. We didn't have to make any proxies. It ran buttery smooth, and also color grading the footage is just really easy and really forgiving. You can really push the image any way you want. I guess another problem with shooting in that kind of format in ProRes, the files are quite big, so we had to spend quite a lot of money on hard drives. I think we ended up filling up around 10 terabytes of footage, and we obviously had to back up the footage and everything like that. But the way I ended up looking was amazing. And we also used the Sigma 18 to 35mm cine lens. And that was pretty much the only lens that we used throughout the whole production. And then on the next project, which is called Above the Knee, which is about a guy who wants to get rid of his left leg. This was shot on the Ursa Mini Pro 12K, which is a $7,000 camera, which is relatively affordable when it comes to cinema cameras. And in form factor is quite similar to the Arri Alexa Mini. But the great thing about this camera is that it's much lighter than the Arri Alexa Mini. A lot of the parts are made out of plastic, but it doesn't feel too cheap. It's light, but not so light that you can't use it handheld. If you use it handheld, you won't get those micro jitters. So similar to the Arri Alexa Mini, we ended up shooting everything handheld with a easy rig. And then we only used one lens, which was the Samyang Scene 25mm T1.5. And we shot everything at around T2. And I think the image quality looked amazing. This was a production that lasted a little bit longer. We were around 3 people behind camera. But this time, we actually used one light for all of the scenes. We used the Aperture 600D through a 8x8 diffusion frame. So we had a little bit more control when it came to the lighting. So this meant that dynamic range wasn't as important. The Ursa Mini Pro 12K has significantly less dynamic range than the Arri Alexa Mini, but since we were able to control the lighting, it wasn't as important. And I think the images we were able to get from the Ursa Mini Pro 12K looked very similar to the Arri Alexa Mini. I think one of the only problems with the Ursa Mini Pro 12K, it becomes grainy quite fast if you're in low light situations. So the camera has a native ISO of 800, but we mostly shot at around 400 ISO. Then also for night scenes, we actually end up going all the way down to 200 ISO to get as much light in as possible to get the cleanest image. We had quite a lot more locations for this film, so we had to travel a lot more, and we were a lot more outside. So it was important that we had a camera that we weren't as afraid of using, and that it wasn't so heavy that it was such a hassle bringing it and transporting it to different locations. The Ursa Mini Pro 12K only shoots in B-RAW. We ended up shooting in B-RAW 8K at a 12:1 compression ratio, and the image looked really good. With the B-RAW, it's really easy to color grade. The only problem compared to the Arri Alexa Mini footage, which is in ProRes, is that the B-RAW is much heavier to edit. We actually didn't end up using proxies, but sometimes it was a little bit laggy editing the footage. That's probably something we should have done. But color grading the footage is really easy with the B-RAW. It looked really good. But the problem with the B-RAW is that the file sizes are really big. We end up filling around 20 terabytes of footage, which is twice the amount of the Arri Alexa Mini. But also the resolution was twice as high, even more than twice as high. The Ursa Mini Pro 12K we shot at 8K, while the Arri Alexa Mini we shot at 3.2K. Another problem with the Ursa Mini Pro 12K is that it doesn't have a OLP filter, a optical low pass filter. There were some times we had some moire issues, and we had to be a little bit more careful when it comes to the costumes we were using. So there were some shots where they kind of weren't usable because there was a noticeable moire. But other than that, it was a great camera to use. And for the last project, we used the Lumix S5, which you can get used for around $800. I can't talk too much about the project itself, and I can't really show footage from the actual film, so I'll use footage from test filming and other footage from the setup I end up using for the film. Similar to the other two projects, this was a very low budget production. We were around 4 people behind camera, and with this production, everything was outside in the forest. What the production needed was a camera setup that was quite light, so we could easily bring it up to the forest and then down again. And then a camera setup that could withstand unpredictable weather, or at least have a camera that we weren't too scared of ruining, since, you know, anything can happen outside in the forest. So I ended up using my own personal Lumix S5. And what we did was that we didn't really have any rig. I just used the camera and the Blazer Remus 35mm, which is a budget anamorphic. And then, because the camera has really good IBIS, I was able to just hold the camera handheld. So compared to the other two cameras, it was just much lighter and an easier setup to just bring up and down and transport with you. And this meant that we could be very fast when it came to getting as many shots as possible. We only used natural light because we were outside in the forest, so it was also important to have pretty decent dynamic range, which I think the camera held up pretty well. At no point did we clip the highlights or anything like that. We always had enough dynamic range for what we were shooting. And also the great thing about this camera, compared to the Ursa Mini Pro 12K and the Arri Alexa Mini, is that this has a dual ISO. So it both has 640 ISO, and you can also shoot at 4000 ISO. Every time we need a little bit more light, we were able to crank up the ISO, which was a little bit of a problem with the Arri Alexa Mini, where we kind of needed more light, but we weren't able to because it didn't have a dual native ISO. And also with the Ursa Mini Pro 12K, if you shoot in low light scenarios, the image breaks pretty easily and becomes very grainy. So that was a great thing with the Lumix S5, having the dual native ISO. And also talking a little bit about file sizes, the Lumix S5 shoots in 422 4K 10-bit H.264, which is quite a compressed format, which then meant that we saved a lot of money on hard drives because the file sizes were so small. It shot at around 150 megabytes per second. So when we were done filming, we only had around 2 terabytes of footage in our hard drive, which is 10 times less than with the Ursa Mini Pro 12K and 5 times less compared to the Arri Alexa Mini. And I think if you compare the footage from the other two cameras, obviously they might look a little bit better, the Ursa Mini Pro 12K and especially the Arri Alexa Mini. But I don't think there's a 5 times difference or a 10 times difference. I would say there's maybe a 5% difference. But yeah, I think the image quality at the Lumix S5, especially if you consider price point compared to the other two cameras, really held up well. At no point did I wish I had more dynamic range or better quality when I was using the Lumix S5. Comparing all the three cameras, I think looking back, if I had to choose one camera to use for all these three productions, I think I would end up using the Lumix S5. And the reason for that is that I would have never dared to bring out the Arri Alexa Mini out in the forest on a small budget production. It would have been way too heavy. We would have been way too scared of ruining it. And with the productions we were making, we wouldn't have enough money to even rent the camera. I think it was just a much safer option using the Lumix S5. And I think if I were to use the Lumix S5 on above the knee or good boy, I honestly think that the audience wouldn't see much of a difference. And I think then we would have saved a lot more money on hard drives and stuff like that. That being said, I'm talking from the standpoint of productions that are very low budget with 2 to 4 people behind the camera. If I were to have a much bigger budget, let's say $1 million or $500,000, I definitely consider using something like the Arri Alexa Mini or the Ursa Mini Pro 12K instead. Actually, if I were to choose a camera on a bigger production, I think I would have chosen something in between the Ursa Mini Pro 12K and the Arri Alexa Mini. Something like the Ursa Mini 12K large format, which has the same dynamic range as the Arri Alexa Mini LF, but is much less expensive compared to that camera. With very small, pretty much no budget productions, I think you're much better off using something much smaller and easier to handle like the Lumix S5. With that, I just want to talk a little bit about why I think we're kind of in the golden age of budget filmmaking. Because I do really believe that any camera you buy that's over $1,000, especially if you buy it used, like the Lumix S5, you really can't go wrong when it comes to image quality. I think pretty much any camera that comes out now is more than good enough when it comes to the image quality and dynamic range and stuff like that. So I think nowadays, when you're deciding on a camera, it's less so about the image quality and more so about the form factor, ease of use, and stuff like that. So I think that is a really good thing with the modern filmmaking and making films in 2025. I think pretty much anyone is able to access good image quality. Just to conclude, I think all these three cameras are great, but I think considering that the Lumix S5 is 30 times cheaper than the Arri Alexa Mini, it's just kind of insane that you can even compare all these three cameras with each other, which really speaks to what a great time it is making films on a lower budget, at least in my opinion. So that was my experience shooting with 3 different cameras at 3 different price points. I hope maybe you guys found this entertaining or learned something. And yeah, see you guys in the next one.